Nova, a very well-known frame in Warframe, has just received a light rework, but this rework is far from a light rework. This is just my opinion, but she is in a much better state right now with the few small tweaks that has been done to her abilities. I liked her before, but I like her even more now. I mean, just look at this damage from her second ability alone. Yeah, that's a lot better, you know? She is amazing at the moment, and it's so difficult because with this update, Kome is really good, as well as Caliban's really good, and now Nova is also amazing. It's just like, okay, there is just so much to this update. But anyway, in this video, we're going to go over everything Nova, how to build her a unique synergy, and just how to play her as a whole. Let's not waste any time. Nova's passive has been reworked, which is much better compared to her previous one, which was emitting blast damage upon her being knocked down. This was stinky. You don't like that. Now, enemies killed while slowed have a 50% chance to drop health orbs, and on the flip side, enemies killed while sped up have a 15% chance to drop energy orbs. This paired with equilibrium is absolutely perfect for Nova's energy sustain, and honestly makes her general gameplay loop feel a lot better, especially when playing high enemy density game modes. Nova's first ability is called Nullstar. Cast a bunch of orbs to rotate around you. These orbs will automatically launch themselves one by one to nearby enemies every 1 second. They will deal blast damage per hit. Each particle will give Nova at base 5% damage reduction, capping at 90%, so you will need 18 particles to get the full 90% damage reduction. The base particles have also been increased from 6 to 12, which makes it a lot easier to reach the 18 particles, as Nullstar is now recastable. It's also important to know that ability duration will increase the amount of particles per cast, and ability strength will increase the amount of damage reduction per particle, meaning with higher strength you need less particles to reach 90% damage reduction. Nullstar's damage reduction now also applies to both shields and health, whereas before it used to just apply to health. This is incredibly useful as this makes Nova the perfect shield tanking frame, and when built correctly, you can actually make Nova somewhat immortal now, before you've taken into account her other abilities. If you kill enemies while affected by molecular fission, which is her fourth ability's augment, you will restore a Nullstar charge with a chance to restore a second Nullstar charge as well. However, we will be going over that one later when we talk about the fourth ability. Nullstar has an augment called Neutron Star. Neutron Star is actually a very good augment in niche cases and can be used as a decent damage dealer to some extent. This augment allows the Nullstar particles to inflict heat damage with a guaranteed status effect in a radius. However, after this rework, the recast time is actually been slowed a bit, which kind of sucks at the moment. You used to be able to spam it like crazy. Recasting the ability will disperse all the current active particles to seek out enemies before being replenished. Neutron Star's seek radius is doubled when you recast it. And if you pair this with Archon Vitality, you can double up on the heat procs, meaning you do more damage. Moving on to her second ability, Antimatter Drop. Let me just say that this ability is now incredibly strong. A little too broken in some cases after its rework. When you cast this ability, you will send out an orb which moves forward slowly. You can shoot this orb to charge it with damage. All the damage absorbed until it's fully charged will be multiplied by 8 times as blast damage when it explodes. Only 5 shots will be absorbed by Antimatter Drop to reach full charge. This does exclude multi-shot. And if you use flat damage arcanes like Merciless, Dexterity, and Deadhead and so on, that will contribute to its damage, so you must make sure that you stack those up before you shoot the orb to get the most amount of damage from the explosion. This also means weapons with higher flat damage output will make this orb do ridiculous damage, especially when pairing the OG incarnates like the Felox, Latum, and Fenmore with the 2000% damage increase evolution. Extra damage from critical and status effects are not absorbed by the particle. The explosion now scales with range, which is where it makes it a lot better. Before it did not. But the flip side is it now requires line of sight from the orb's perspective. So this is the downside. But honestly, this makes sense, and it's already extremely powerful with the line of sight. And I personally prefer the increased range with line of sight, because if it didn't require the line of sight and we got this range increase, you could effectively just sit in the middle of a room with a max range build and fall asleep, which you can already do to some extent. So it's not that bad, it's not a big nerf. The range just overshadows this change. When you cast Antimatter Drop, you can charge it and then launch the orb by tapping the ability again. The orb will launch to where your reticle is pointing, so when you tap it, you can move your orb around as it's busy flying. So the way to play this ability is cast the orb, shoot the orb, tap the ability again to where you want it to go, and enjoy explosions. Also, don't forget to prime your enemies with your force to increase its damage, which we'll go over in a second. Antimatter Drop will synergize with Wormhole, her third ability, by charging halfway when it goes through a wormhole. Antimatter has an augment called Antimatter Absorb. Now, this augment allows the orb to absorb incoming enemy fire, adding to its total damage potential. I don't really like this augment. I haven't found a good synergy for this just yet. Personally, I don't see the need for this augment. Maybe I'm wrong. If I have missed the niche setup, please let me know in the comments below. Moving on to her third ability, which is Wormhole. Cast a portal that allows you to teleport to the other side where its trail leads to. At base, it will go up to 50 meters, which is a very far teleport to be fair. The wormhole trail is centered to where your reticle is aimed at when you cast. Enemies and allies can pass through it, allowing you to instantly teleport straight through. You can use each portal up to 4 times before it disappears. Wormhole has slightly changed with the rework. It now no longer has a duration, so the portals will stay up indefinitely. Also, there will be little icons above the wormhole to let you know how many times you can use that specific portal before it disappears. You can also shoot through wormhole and your weapon's projectile will shoot out the exit point. This is particularly good with AoE weapons or explosive projectiles, allowing you to wormhole to a group of enemies and kill them from afar. Wormhole does have an augment called Escape Velocity, and this augment just simply increases the speed of you and your allies by 50% for 7 seconds after you teleport through it. This is just a handy quality of life augment, it's not anything crazy. Her fourth ability is called Molecular Prime. Now this is Nova's bread and butter and what makes her so special. This ability has been reworked significantly, but before I go into this ability, it's currently bugged at the moment, which will most likely be patched. There is no timer on the ability, so you will just have to periodically recast the ability, which you would have done anyway, let's be honest. Molecular Prime now has a tap and a hold function to it. Tap the ability to slow enemies, and hold it to speed up enemies. So no longer do we have to mod for a positive or negative strength to get the respective effect from her fourth. This is really nice as we now have more build diversity. Both the slow and the speed are capped at 75% and will scale with the same amount of strength. The base slow and speed is increased to 50% now, and you only need 150% strength to get the 75% speed increase or decrease. Her fourth ability will prime enemies with antimatter. When they are affected by antimatter, they will receive 100% damage vulnerability and will detonate on death, dealing blast damage to nearby enemies. It's important to know that ability duration will affect the wave radius and not ability range. So the longer the duration, the further the wave will go. The speed up from Molecular Prime will bypass enemies with Overguard, and the bonus damage multiplier now applies to all Overguard, health, and shields. This makes her fourth ability a very powerful ability to do even more damage. And not to mention that her fourth ability now synergizes with her passive, giving you much better energy sustain. Molecular Prime has an augment called Molecular Fission. Enemies that are primed with Molecular Prime will restore Nullstar charges when killed and cause Nullstar to inflict Molecular Prime. A handy augment is actually incredibly good because it keeps up your damage reduction. I would highly suggest running this. This is like my go-to augment with her. And that concludes all of her abilities and augments. Before we move on, if I could ask if you could hit that like button, thank you so much for your support, my fellow tenno. Alright, now that we have all this info, how do we actually put it to use? When you load into your missions, your first ability should be up at all times. Nullstar is your defense and is what gives you your damage reduction. If this runs out, you will most likely die. Then cast your fourth ability so that you prime enemies. Whether you slow them up or speed them up, it's your choice. Your goal is to prime as many enemies with antimatter from your fourth so that they receive damage vulnerability, and they will also have a higher chance to drop a health or energy orb depending on the effect applied. So this synergizes with her new passive. If you are a fan of the orb playstyle, you simply charge the orb and just launch it straight to a group of enemies, which will effectively delete them entirely. The damage vulnerability applied from your fourth will also increase the damage from your second, so make sure to keep that in mind. Use Wormhole at your own discretion. It's technically a very good movement ability, but personally I don't like it. I find Wormhole to be useful in niche cases, like open world bounties and the drones from specific bounties in the open worlds. It's things like that where Wormhole shines for me personally. I don't like using it in tight spaces. I'd rather bonk my head with parkour velocity. This is a personal opinion. If you like it, then by all means use it. Also, it's funny to troll your teammates with it once in a while. Remember to gather stacks if you are in steel path from your deadhead, merciless, or dexterity, so you can increase your base damage to the orb, which would increase the damage of the explosion. Before we go into how to build Nova, I want to quickly talk about the famous Speedver and Slowver playstyle. Some of you already know this playstyle and some of you may not know about it. This is where Nova has shined for a long time among many other things that she is good for. Her fourth ability can speed up and slow enemies down. In certain missions and niche cases, this is incredibly handy. Certain missions where you want to defend or make sure that enemies don't get to the objective, then you can use the slow from her fourth ability. In loot runs, in survival or defense missions, or arbitrations, or just any mission you actually want the enemies to be sped up to do the mission quicker, you can then just use the speed version. Honestly, Nova is absolutely perfect for that, with duration. You can make her bubble scale really far and pretty much prime enemies with antimatter in different rooms. It can be really powerful when used correctly. Just please don't use the slow when you need to speed up enemies, as you will probably piss off your allies. Let's be real here. However, you can use her where you think she will shine. The next thing I want to talk about is her two augments. More specifically, the molecular fission and neutron star paired together. These two work really well since molecular fission allows your null star to prime enemies with antimatter, and it will also recharge your null star charges. Whereas neutron star will send out the particles applying heat damage with double the radius. These two augments paired with the damage vulnerability from your fourth just work really well together. And you can also run Archon Vitality to further boost the Neutron Star's damage because it will double the heat procs per cast. I would highly recommend running the dual augment setup with whatever build you run, or at least molecular fission. This finally leads me onto how to build a no helmet Nova. Because of how Nova's abilities scale, we need to focus on duration and range, but we will be needing a little bit of strength so that we can get the full slow effect, which will be 155% strength. In the star chart, you can get away with about 130%, that will be more than enough. Of course, we'll be going over the new players first. For the early star chart players, you can run any aura you have on hand. Then you can simply run 4 mods for Nova. Continuity as duration is the best when it comes to Nova because of her abilities and how they scale with duration. You get more particles from your first ability and your fourth goes on for longer. Equilibrium to sort out your energy issues because of her passive. Flow for more total energy, however this is optional, and then just stretch. The reason for stretch is to increase the explosion radius of her second ability, and I find 145% range or 175% range to be the sweet spot for Nova. This is what the super budget build looks like. As you progress, you start adding more mods onto your build as you invest into her. You can add Energy Nexus, although this may be overkill for energy sustain, so this is a flexible mod. You can also go Mobilize for quality of life. Intensify, Fast Deflection, and Augur Message. This is what the final star chart build looks like. You can drop Energy Nexus for an augment if you manage to get your hands on one of her augments in the star chart. I would highly recommend going for Molecular Fission first. And that's it for the beginner builds. Now we move on to the Steel Path players. You have two choices here. For the no helmet Steel Path build, you can run a dual augment setup or you can run a single augment setup. For the aura slot, you can go Corrosive Projection, Brief Respite, or Growing Power, whichever one tickles your fancy. If you are going for the dual augments, then go Molecular Fission and Neutron Star, as these synergize really well with each other. Then we go Continuity, Equilibrium, Adaptation, as Nova's damage reduction now affects your shields as well, Stretch to increase the range of your explosions, Umbral Intensify, and Primed Flow. We then run Arcane Aegis. In my opinion, this is a must-have for Nova, as this paired with Adaptation makes her a huge shield tank. Arcane Aegis makes it very difficult for you to die. It's literally a cheat code. I ran Molt Augmented as we are just shy of 155% strength with the setup. You can, if you want, change out Brief Respite for Growing Power to get the necessary strength, and then you can run another Arcane, but that's up to you. Alternatively, you can drop Neutron Star and run a different mod to fill up the stats that you need if you don't want to run the dual augment playstyle. And that concludes the no helmet build for Nova. I have tested this in a bunch of missions, and honestly, it's super countable even in solo steel paths. Her orb alone just absolutely carries her right now. We now move on to the helmet setups. For all of the helmet builds, I have subsumed off her third ability. Like I explained in the how to play her section, I don't really like Wormhole. I don't see how you can subsume anything else from a kit as they all work so well. If you still want speed, you can honestly just run parkour velocity shards. The first setup we have is an armor stripping setup. There are a bunch of armor stripping subsumes that you can use, but I personally went for a Phantom Eyes because yes, they do slow enemies down when her fort does the same thing, but it will slowly armor strip them in a decent radius, which is really nice. You can also go Terrified, but you need quite a bit of strength to do so, and it's a very expensive ability in terms of energy, so it comes down to your personal preference and what you like for armor stripping. But this will allow your orb to do even more damage than it already does. It's just more satisfying numbers, as let's be honest, Nova does not need a subsume to function even before her rework. We then have a funny one, which also further pushes the damage from our second ability and just the general explosions from our fourth. We subsume Tempest Barrage onto our third, equip Viral Tempest, which allows us to easily apply max viral and corrosive procs onto enemies. This will make enemies weaker, and Tempest Barrage itself will actually kill enemies with the damage. Pair this with the damage vulnerability and null star as well as molt augmented to increase the strength, and you simply get a build that doesn't require weapons. You can kill groups of enemies like this, and the only thing is the Eximus units will need to be taken out with your weapons or with your second ability, and honestly it's just overkill in terms of damage. You don't need it, it's just fun, I guess. And this is what the full setup looks like. Be sure to change the build to your liking. I also have a Nourish and Raw setup. Both work the same with just slight changes in the build. If you subsume Nourish onto your third, you can get away with not running Flow and maybe put 1 or 2 blue shards to get max energy. Nourish helps us do more damage with Neutron Star and our explosions as well, and it will help us with energy sustain. When you ramp this build up with Molt Augmented, you can literally nuke enemies by just spamming your 1. You will have the same issue of needing to kill Eximus units as they are a bit tougher, but for the most part you will delete groups of easy enemies with this setup. If you do subsume Raw, you can just use 2 blue shards to help with energy sustain, and make sure to use Equilibrium. Both of them work really well, and this is what the template would look like. A very fun setup with Nova, I would highly recommend it. We then have the most interesting synergy with Nova, and that is Zarta's Whisper. Zarta's Whisper is particularly broken with Nova when paired with her 4th ability. This is because when you kill an enemy affected by the bubble and they explode, it will spread a Zarta's bubble to nearby enemies and carry that damage over. There are 2 ways you can go about the energy sustain here. You can just use Flow to increase the max energy, or you can go Equilibrium with 2 blue shards. It's up to you. However, I actually ran the setup with just Flow and her passive, and it was still fine. The reason for this is because you're not hardcore spamming as much and the enemies are being deleted in groups, so you can get away with it. Now you can further maximize this damage output by pairing it with the OG incarnates like Felox, Fenmore and Latum. This will increase your damage drastically. It's a really satisfying setup as everything just goes boom. Here is what the build looks like. Now I do want to make a disclaimer. Yes, I have shown you all of these fancy helmet setups, and yes, they all look flashy and explosive with these synergies, but I'm gonna be real. She doesn't need it. Her second ability does all of that in an instant, just because of the range change. So these setups are up to you if you want to subsume something off. Otherwise, that concludes all of her builds. We now move on to Archon shards. I would highly recommend running 1 or 2 blue shards if you do not run Flow. Duration shards are godly, and I would recommend running 1 or 2 of these or even more, and then 1 or 2 casting speeds would work really well with her. In terms of her synergies, for your general missions, I would highly recommend running the Nautilus Companion with Nova, especially the nuke playstyles as it fits perfectly with her. Nova with a pull mechanic is just pure dopamine. Here is the Nautilus build that I run, and then on the flip side, running a Hound to prime enemies with a bunch of status effects is even more deadly with Nova, and this is the build that I run. In terms of the weapons to use with Nova, any weapon with super high base damage, but the OG Incarnants or the new Incarnants are really good to use with her orb in terms of the damage scaling. The Felox is particularly broken as it can one-tap the orb as well. This finally leads me on to my final thoughts for Nova. She is really good at the moment. She was strong before, but now she's much better in terms of damage and quality of life features. I really like her now, and I would love to play her more often in missions. If I'm being honest, if you take into account how tanky Nova is, and how much damage this frame can push out with her second ability, not to mention the fact that you can slow enemies and give them damage vulnerability. She's S tier now, and I can say that confidently. I would really recommend investing into Nova now. You will not regret it. I have just done a video on the new Caliban rework too, if you want to go and check that out, as he is so much stronger at the moment as well. And as always, a huge thank you to all of our amazing channel members, and a special thank you to Darwin, Fish, Joshua, Villa, Caden, Trum, Shakiro, Gilbert, Ayrton Yard, and Tythrax. Thank you so much. You guys are amazing. All right, enjoy Nova with explosions.